Lynn, this is a question along a similar vein, which came up from the question itself came from a combination of the Stanford group, but it was the Stanford group actually discussing a report that came out of a conference that was held in June in Paris by a number of economists, most of them American, but some of them representing other countries as well, which included the American economist Jamie Galbraith. This is the Economists for Peace and Security, as well as the Initiative for Rethinking the Economy. And the question is as follows. See, Mr. LaRouche, without question, the growing assessment of all of us, but also of economists all over the world, is that the IMF is essentially beyond repair. The organization exists outside the framework of law, and it routinely violates its own charter with impunity, particularly in denying to member states the right to impose control over capital flows. As I think you know, under the charter of the IMF, members do have the right to demand reduction in terms of repayment. Yet, the IMF and the World Bank routinely seek to set themselves apart as creditors preferred above anyone else. Conditionality and austerity are imposed on the most vulnerable member countries with the objective of undermining the most basic human economic rights under conditions that preclude any possibility of effective economic recovery. I think we can all agree that adding funds and power to this organization is an exercise in self-defeat. In fact, the very concept of a reformed IMF is an oxymoron. However, they say, while there really is no question that in an ideal world, what you've called a four-power agreement to replace the currently dysfunctional international monetary institutions would certainly be the most preferable option. However, there does not really seem to be an immediate appetite for this. One proposal that has been put before us as an alternative to a single reserve asset world is something that we wanted your opinion on because there's some lack of clarity among us. And certainly this is different than the market basket of currencies that has been proposed elsewhere, but we are not sure this is workable. What we have been handed is an alternative to a single reserve asset system that would pursue the development of regional monetary authorities, which could, among other things, make dollar reserve assets earned by countries that are successful net exporters available to neighbors who are not. Such authorities would have distinct advantages over a global system because, one, the regional fund has a direct stake in the success of the other member countries under its authority, and two, a structured system like this would give small countries some of the advantages and margin for maneuver that are now enjoyed by large countries in both the developed and developing world. And three, regional power can be deployed effectively over regional financial institutions. The drawback of this is I think, clear, but is there anything salvageable as far as you can see in this proposal, especially as an interim measure to be taken?
What you have to look at is you have to look at the Glass-Steagall Act by President Franklin Roosevelt, which was Larry Summers from inside the Clinton administration when Clinton was in trouble, managed to screw up. You have to have, and the first step in dealing with any monetary question today, or any question of currency, you must put every system of the planet through internal bankruptcy reorganization. This planet has been polluted. All the financial transactions polluted by this process of which began, really was unleashed in 1987 with the 1987 crash, under which, in effect, the Greenspan unleashed hell on earth in the form of financial derivatives. It's a swindle. Now, most of the debt and most of the listed assets which are under discussion in most parts of the world today are completely fraudulent. If you apply a Glass-Steagall standard, which you must apply because it's the one existing standard which is reliable for all countries, every country in the world can apply that standard the same way. You apply the Glass-Steagall standard and you take this pile of so-called monetary assets, financial assets over here, put a big pile here. Now you put a test. It's like you're going to heaven or you're going to hell. Huh? And at the gates, you've got St. Peter. He's watching at the gate. Somebody comes up and says, we have this financial asset. He says, downstairs, please. And by the time you've gone through the process, there are very few saved Christians or anybody else left up there. So you have a much smaller number of claims, of financial claims on the system as a whole. You have eliminated the waste material. You've had the great X-Lax event of the century. And therefore, we should not talk about the existing so-called national monetary assets, because they're polluted. We have to cancel most of them. You know, I think about $25 to $30 trillion of the debt listed as the assets and claims of the United States ought to be just gone. Now we've got to go back to a hard credit dollar. We have to transform the US dollar from a monetarist dollar to a hard credit dollar, which means that suddenly agriculture and industry and other things become the means anymore, no longer financial speculation. Financial speculation is a crime. I think we ought to make that as a part of our, criminal law. The practice of monetarism should be outlawed as a crime against humanity. Certainly, monetarism has killed more people on this planet than any known disease. Shouldn't we outlaw it? Its only rival is drug trafficking. Shouldn't we outlaw it? So therefore, when we talk about a relation among national currencies, we mean the currency of a national credit system, in which a sovereign government declares, this is our money. It's not somebody else's money. It's not some international cartel. Governments don't borrow money from international financial institutions. It's a matter of their relationship with an institution, their sovereign relationship to any private institution. It's not a matter of international institutions. What has killed the world since the time of ancient Greece, since the Peloponnesian War, what was the problem? Was it an economic problem? No, it wasn't. It was a monetary problem. The question was, you had, after the defeat of the Persian Empire's attempt to take over the Eastern Mediterranean, after the great battle where this occurred, you had three foci of Greeks, what we call today Greek-speaking culture, in the Mediterranean, which had a certain relationship with Egypt, which unfortunately at that time was under Persian occupation. So, and Egypt was an essential part of the culture. The relationship of Greece, historical relationship of Greece to the culture of the Greek culture and the Etruscan culture, for example, were a key part from the 7th century BC onward. So you had suddenly the Persian Empire that attempted to take over the area of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, using its alliance with Tyre as a key part of this process. And so this whole period through the triumph of Alexander the Great is of this particular type of nature, where Egypt came back into the situation as an independent power. Tyre was destroyed, and the Persian Empire was gobbled up by Alexander, who tried to assimilate it into a new kind of international system. He was poisoned, probably by Aristotle, who had tried to poison him before, but this time probably successfully. But so this is the period. So what had happened is, in this period, before Alexander's events, you had these Greek influences, which were, apart from being political influences, were actually economic interests. The economic interests of maritime power, Greek civilization, and also predominantly, historically, Egyptian civilization. The Etruscan civilization was essentially maritime power, not land power. And thus these nations, which had emerged in the melting of the glaciers and up to the present levels of seas today, these powers had existed on the basis of trade. They produced things and they traded. The trade was based on the existence of monetary systems. The monetary system of reference for the Greek-speaking people of that period was the cult of Delphi, which was an Asian intrusion into European civilization. And the priests of the cult of Delphi, playing their magic tricks and so forth, got these three parts. One centered on Athens, another centered on Corinth, which is the Sparta area, the other centered on Syracuse. And they started out with a war between the two Greek-speaking areas, which were rivals in trade on the basis of monetary rivals, of who was going to be the monetary power. So they got into a war, the beginning of the Peloponnesian War, the first phase, which is Athens against Corinth. The Athenians, the Ionians against this Peloponnesian War. Then, not satisfied with that piece of folly, which had almost destroyed the joint, they went to a war with Syracuse and did the same thing, another great power in the Mediterranean. Syracuse was the center of intellectual and monetary, financial power and economic power in that region. Boom. So they destroyed themselves for the sake of another power. So you had systems of monetarism, which private ownership of money, or the equivalent of money, were determined power. And the wars of the world, particularly of European civilization, since that time to the present day have been a struggle for imperial power of private interests above nation states, imperial power above nation states. That's what the meaning of empire is. Empire is not, the British Empire is not an empire because the British control the world. If you know British people, they're not capable of controlling the world. They can't even control themselves. But they can control some stupid Americans. But the power lies in the power of a private interest, a private monetary interest, a money interest, which by controlling money and credit based on the idea of money, control nations as from above. This is what imperialism is in the European experience. It's monetarism, like that of John Maynard Keynes. It's monetarism. And that's where the problem lies. When we get rid of monetarism, by going from, as our American founders understood, from the time of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, get rid of monetarism. get rid of the international imperial power of private monetary interests over nation states. Establish the superiority of the sovereignty of the nation state over all other power. And define world relations on the relations among sovereign nation states, like the U.S. Constitution prescribes. This is our unique genius in our system, is the Hamiltonian feature of the U.S. Constitution. And thus, if you want to have a reform, the first thing you do is you take the monetarists out and melt them down, because they're not real. Because that's what you've got to do. So don't talk about relations, about state-to-state relation or system-to-system relation. You've got to get rid of syphilis first. Get rid of the syphilis before you try sex.